Most unlikely of villains, smooths of brain and for pause. Does it talk? Does it know how? Does it bottle? Does it meow? In the lair of the cerebral bore, and will show him so much more. We'll leave your brains at the
Welcome back to Cerebrivore. Today we're going to talk about horror and how to try to run a successful horror RPG maintaining a serious atmosphere. As always, I'm your moderator, Jason from Nerds RPG Variety Cast. I have an esteemed panel today. I guess we'll just go by, I'm trying to think here. I guess we'll just go alphabetical order. That's the easiest way to do it. So we're going to go with Anthony, also known as Runeslinger first, of the Casting Shadows Media Empire. How are you doing tonight, Anthony?
I'm doing all right, of course. It's morning here.
That's true. Yeah, you're coming from the future.
That's right.
Yeah.
Can't let go of that time travel episode.
No. We definitely. You want to just real quickly give us a brief rundown with you with RPGs and maybe horror RPGs, if any?
My first horror RPG was Call of Cthulhu. And that was the first game I really wanted to try running after I realized that I was having some relationship issues with Dungeons and Dragons, and where I had to say to Dungeons and Dragons, it's not you, it's me. And so starting with Call of Cthulhu, where I got a trial by fire in how to be scary, right? But it was also kind of an awakening for me that I could be scary and I could be a game master where people were saying, dude, when we play in next, that was a real eye opener for me. So I stuck with horror after that. Beyond the Supernatural was an easy segue because we were already playing Palladium. And then I never saw a copy of Chill to buy, just to hear about. So then the next horror thing that came along was World of Darkness, which you could get everywhere. And for about a decade, that's really our primary game. We played other games on the side, but it was all of the World of Darkness games all together, all the time, every day of the week, for a very long time. And it's difficult sometimes to bring out the horror aspect of the World of Darkness rather than the violence or the cool powers or whatever. And most recently, jumping many decades, most recently Alien is what I've been playing.
Very cool. And I realize now, looking, I did not go in alphabetical order. I'm going to apologize to Alex because L does come before N in the English alphabet. Usually. But Alex, one of the hosts of the Ultimate Effort podcast, author of ICRPG Altered State, and go ahead. I'll let you fill in there, Alex.
Yeah, I'm doubly upset to go after Anthony now after his pedigree. I feel completely lackluster here in comparison. I will say I might be the worst guest to talk about horror because it's not my favorite genre at all. I don't run a lot of it typically. That being said, I would say in terms of traditional D&D or ICRPG or tons of systems that I have run, generally I really enjoy dark fantasy. So I do pick up some of the horror elements when I run those types of games. Joe can certainly attest. I've run him through the gristmill a few times. But I have been DMing a long time, and I would like to think that perhaps tonight maybe I'm going to have some insight, maybe for some folks who are a little bit like me, maybe who are considering running some horror games and maybe some patterns or some behaviors to really kind of eke out some enjoyable games in that genre. So that's my hope, and we'll see if I'm effective in that vein tonight.
Excellent. You're the person on the panel that our average viewer can relate with, right?
That's my hope, or even below average, because that's sort of where I hang out. So,
excellent. And finally we have Joe, who really doesn't need an introduction, but Go ahead, Joe.
Right? Needs no introduction because what else could you say about the unknown element? No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Yeah, no, it's great to be back. Great to see you again, Anthony, Jason, and Alex. We're together on the Ultimate Effort show, so that's a fun thing. I'm used to that guy. But yeah, for horror, like jumping right into it. I'm an author of some horror. I frequently mix that in with most everything I write. I have written a horror adventure specifically based into horror. But as far as like my first introduction to it, it started with World of Darkness. You know, we played a little bit of vampire when that first came out, and then werewolf came out, and it was like, oh, and I was a big fan of, you know, American Werewolf in Paris, or American Werewolf in London. Sorry, the original. So
Right.
I was the forever GM, you know, when we were kids, all in the 90s, you know, back high school and everything, junior high. And so I wanted American Werewolf in London. So I started, you know, had all the players started as human, and we kind of went more in that more direct horror, less of the violence kind of thing of you're all mundane, normal folks kind of a bit, and introducing the werewolves. And then of course they all got bitten, infected, and that kind of changed the element of the game. But I'd like to think that 13-year-old me was a pretty scary game master. But you know, it did carry on. I discovered Call of Cthulhu. I did play quite a bit of that. You know, and I've played a lot of systems. We liked to jump back and forth between a lot of games because all of our friends, we did kind of rotate through who was playing, and that was usually week to week or who was running. Mothership was probably the most recent for horror. That's got a pretty great handle on that sci-fi spin for it. But I'm a fan of the genre, even if I don't always run that genre. I do include elements of it in pretty much everything, pretty much every game. There will be some notes because it's a good seasoning for the soup. So
Excellent.
That's me.
No, great. So where to start with this? I get, like I say, we're not going to really talk about playing pulp horror or things like that, because that's pretty normal. I think that's kind of, when we talk horror and RPGs, I think that's the standard, what people think of. Even when we do Call of Cthulhu, you know, people, it depends on the game master and the game, of course, but I think a lot of groups probably stock up on the Tommy guns and you know, get their dynamite and go out. But that's not really what we're talking about here tonight. We're talking about actually, again, of course, we'll get into this, I guess, but you're never going to scare the characters, and you don't necessarily want to. I don't think, and I'm interested in your guys' thoughts on this. You're not trying to scare the players, but my idea is that the players should, like, to me, a good movie, good horror movie is when 2 days later I'm still thinking about, like, that was messed up, you know, and you're still processing it, right? And to me, a good game is that same way, where you're still thinking. You know, it's not so much that, you know, I managed to pull a jump scare on my players, but it's the idea that, you know, the thoughts and the concepts or you know, the actions of a character are still you know, reverberating down the road.
And that's a good tag, because I mean, just what you said, it's a jump scare, right? It's not jump horror. Horror is the overall genre or category of that condition, but then there's things inside it that may or may not be useful to you in the moment. We might not want any jump scares at all. We might want that slow build of discomfort, and that's all we want is people to leave the table thinking that was gross, or that was messed up, or, you know,
right? Yeah, it's definitely,
what if that really happened?
Yeah, it's a tone that you kind of aim for with it. And you know, like, we going back to the jump scare again, because I mean, great like term right there. But in a role-playing game, like at the table, that's probably one of the harder things to actually do, is get the jump scare without that big like jumping to scare everybody. Like, it's a hard thing to sell that at the table. But I really think for a successful horror game, I think the first thing has to start with that player buy-in. All your buddies at the table have to, I mean, you need that little bit of buy-in for everybody to know that this is where we're going, this is what we're aiming for, because that's going to help you achieve that tone, which kind of pulls the whole thing together. You know, it's where the goosebumps come from. You know, you can help set some mood lighting, get some candles out on the table. Don't burn your books. But yeah. If I could pull up a jump scare at the table, that would be amazing.
Well, I mean, it's just sliding and dropping that book, right?
I suppose when the bear trap, goes off, you can slam your hand on the table, unexpectedly. But I feel like that sort of thing only works once, maybe, right? And so in terms of like what we're talking about, I think there's a disconnect, right, between feeling these things as a person and then being a person behind a character in a game, right? So you could go out to all the fright farms that are out right now during the month of October, and you could experience the traditional pieces of horror. You can experience uncertainty, you can experience loss of control, you can experience all these things that frighten you. But in terms of translating that at the table, I think that's a whole different ballgame, because I think there's a disconnect. And certainly we can't even reach people as game masters the same way that movies or other media do. We don't have the same pacing. We don't have the same visual elements. We don't have those same pieces at our disposal. And I think it's a much more difficult burden.
It's true.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Or, go ahead.
You familiar with Dread?
Yep. Yeah, that's the game of the candles, right? Or is that the Jenga tower?
Jenga tower?
Yeah.
Oh,
right. 10 candles is but it's in the same kind of category. Right. So you've got the Jenga tower, and so that's directly designed to impact the player.
There's your jump scare.
And people will love it because they are afraid of being, of knocking it over. They're invested in the risk. This is the game mechanic. This is the risk and reward. It's all physical. It's all centered in the player, which means that in-character experience, right, separate from myself, or on a more authorial level, my awareness of what the character is experiencing, those are both kind of relegated to the background, while that foreground player experience of real, actual dread, or at least anticipation, is brought into the foreground. It's not my character that's afraid. It's me that's afraid.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting flip. Whereas I'm not going to have that in a Call of Cthulhu game, but I can still have the anticipation, right, about the dice. And does the play group know how to translate that emotion about the dice into a recognition of the feeling of the character? I'm nervous because I want to roll the right number, but my character's nervous because they're opening the door, right? So then the dice becomes opening the door in a way that the Jenga tower falling doesn't. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
For folks who can't see, because they'll be listening to this, I'm nodding vigorously at everything that Anthony's saying just now.
Right.
I want to make that clear.
Yeah, I think because you can go too far. Now, Dread is a little bit different because it is that physical interaction, but I think there are certain things environmentally you can do to help. And obviously, this is going to change online. Online play changes this dramatically, but in person, you can do things like turn down the lights and put candles around, things like that. Even though you probably can pull off a jump scare, like dropping a book once during the game or something like that. I don't know. I actually know somebody. I wasn't in this game, but I know somebody who had coordinated with their roommate that to have the roommate go outside during the game and like tap on the windows and stuff, and which is really
good.
Cool. Yeah. But you don't want to get to the point where you're doing like a Billy Freakin thing, right? Like, the director of The Exorcist, where you're shooting a shotgun off behind somebody, right? You to get the actor to jump. You can take like the physical thing too far. Not that I would suggest, not that I'm saying anybody would do that, but I think maybe trying to go with the physical props, or like props are a different thing. And I'm sure we'll talk about
the
props.
Environment.
But the environment, I think, or trying to get that loud noise jump scare thing. I think maybe you can detract from the game if you lean into that kind of thing too much.
I mean, heck, you can turn the air conditioning up.
Yeah,
give everybody a little extra chill. Like, just those little things like that can kind of just like heighten that edge. I mean, it's more of like into that immersion.
Mhm.
But I do have to
Yeah.
call out again. You mentioned the slamming the book or sliding the book off the table. I cannot believe in my entire history of gaming, I have never once thought about doing that to get a jump scare at the table. Just dropping a book. That's brilliant, man. I can't believe I'm right over my head. That's great.
Are you guys stand up GMs or sit down GMs?
I'm a stander. Like, I mean, live in person games, I usually
Yeah.
stand because I don't know, like, I mean, Alex can tell you, even when we're playing online, because we usually play online regularly. I mean, you guys can see it right now. Those who can't see the video, I'm animated when I talk, like
Yes.
I'm using my hands and everything. So I usually stand up because I got that energy, and like I try to hype the table, I guess. So like I'm just used to trying to make the table an energetic space. I like to do the voices and things. I'll do, like the hunched over for some of the NPCs, like, or different
Yeah.
things. Like, so I'm definitely a stander. I stand to do that. And in horror, it can actually be a benefit because you kind of get that towering over the top of people, and that can kind of help like set things a little on edge. And again, that kind of, I guess, ties back to like that environment or that tone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about you guys?
Well, yeah, go ahead, answer that, and then I've got a question after that. But let's throw it to Alex. Are you a sitter or a stander?
I think I'm primarily a sitter. I mean, I think certainly there are times where I might end up standing, during an exciting moment. But for sure, I'm probably going to be sitting at the table. And I want to talk in a minute maybe how I might approach this, because I don't know that I necessarily would do like slasher type horror. If I were to run horror, I don't know that I would do jump scare type horror. I think in a way, even for me, the slow burn would probably be a little bit easier to run. And I'll tell you some of my thoughts I had sort of in anticipation of this talk. But go ahead, Jason. What's your question?
Well, what I was going to say before we get too deep, for us, maybe there's an understood thing, but we should approach this for a general audience. Definitely, we kind of touched on this, but you really need to have that, whether you want to call it session zero, whether it's what Joe had talked about, talk with your players ahead of time. But you really need to know where you can and can't go to be safe, because it's one thing to unsettle your players in a way that they're okay with. It's another thing to probe at something that they're not comfortable with being probed, right? If they have that, overwhelming fear of spiders, or they have some traumatic event that's happened in their life that they definitely don't want to revisit, you know what I mean? So definitely you want to, horror is a game where safety tools are important, and the idea of knowing your players, which can be hard at a convention game, right? Or an impromptu game.
But I would say, if you had any sort of time at all, session zero or whatever before the session, I would probably even poll the audience, so to speak, and say, when you think of horror, what is it about it that really sort of amps you up? Is it the blood and gore? Are you more the, you just want to see, like, throw me in, coach, let me see if I can survive? Or do you more prefer like a jump scare type thing? Like, what is it that you really sort of appreciate in the genre? And then I might try to sort of tailor the game to try to hit as many of those pieces as possible,
Right. That's really satisfying when you're playing with your group, so that you can keep more things close to the vest, right? That Bob's afraid of spiders, so we're not going to have spiders in this thing, but we can have something that can help Bob bridge the gap between his fear of spiders and what's happening to his character, right? There can be a scuttling.
Yeah.
Lots of things scuttle, and I don't really like things that scuttle. So he's thinking it better not be spiders. He's giving you, he's looking daggers at you. Better not be spiders, man. But then you walk it back, and you can play with it without ever crossing his line, without ever having to talk about it. And I think that's what's really hard at convention games or whatever, when you're playing with strangers, is how to be fair to the player, and fair to the scenario, and fair to whatever reason, to yourself. Yeah. Why did you want to run this thing? Finding that common ground. So a lot of the safety tools these days are being published under the header of not getting consensus, right? Not getting a agreement, but getting permission.
Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly.
And is it okay for me to do this? Which can make horror in particular not much fun in that convention environment.
Mhm.
I basically wouldn't, at this point in my life, I wouldn't bother going to a convention to run a horror game. I save it for my friends. And
Right. Yeah,
but,
that's definitely a good point. So I mean,
Yep.
even among friends, there are topics that I just will never touch because
Right.
I don't like them. So like, but with spiders, I have a problem with spiders, but I don't mind having them in a game because I know that spider's not real. Even though it's going to make me squirm in my chair, I know it's not real, and I'm about to roll to attack it or roll to run the hell away. But things like that, like, fear of spiders, I'll take the spiders because I know it's something that, especially if it's a horror game, I know that's something that's already going to help me immerse myself and help my character be a little bit more, into it. That full player buy-in.
Mhm.
Kind of
Yeah, but yeah, it's definitely easier with your group, and we can probably move like I've played games with people whose spouses have committed suicide, right? So suicide or anything is off the table in those kind of games, which is fine, and it would be disrespectful to them as a person to cross those lines and I'm going to push it, so but that's something your group needs to work through and you can do. But I just wanted to bring that up just because I think we're all there on that, but that since it's a podcast going out to everyone, the internet,
right.
the quote unquote the internet, right? So
I was asking about standing up because it's one of the tools that I like to use about controlling the environment is I can control myself.
Mm-hmm.
So I might be sitting down because you're having that conversation with the lawyer about, well, you've just inherited this house and it's a great house, but there's one or two problems with it, like the ghost or whatever.
It's not the plumbing.
Right. So for that, I might be sitting down. But then when they meet the agitated groundskeeper, I might be standing up and I might be physically showing agitation and not in an acting performance kind of way, but just a little bit to like the subwoofer in your car, to add a little bit of oomph to it. But there's also my position in the room. Where am I standing? So if I'm in a living room like this, where all the furniture is against the wall, I'm kind of trapped in the center of the room. I can only meet you face on. So I don't like to play games in the living room. I like to play them where I can get behind you also.
Ooh, yeah. Walk around the table.
Right. And I might spend a considerable amount of time standing behind Jason. His character isn't even in the scene. I just keep standing behind Jason. And then at one point I might lean down and kind of whisper close to him where only he can hear something about his character, And
that's good.
Like, how is it to be locked in the trunk of that car? And then I just walk away and he's thinking, my character's locked in the trunk of the car. How'd that happen? And now he's all agitated. And then I can come back and, so that kind of stuff's a lot of fun. But I might have someone who actually gets really uncomfortable, not enjoyably upset, but upset. And so it's an interesting line to walk. But
yeah, no, it definitely. Well, and I think maybe did you have somewhere else you were going, Alex, before I switch us up?
Well, I don't know where you're going. So
well, I was going to say so I guess some genres are probably easier to do than others, right? Within horror. So you mentioned slasher earlier, and while you could do slashers here, typically slashers, especially when we think of due to our age, we're all roughly around the same age. I'm going to assume, and so for growing up, it's Friday the 13th, Halloween, My Bloody Valentine, right? And so for us, the slashers, they're not really that scary. They're it's more you're looking for an inventive kills, so they're not real, and which is embodied in some games like Slasher Flick, where it has ways to have multiple characters, so you can definitely have character deaths during the game, because what's a slasher if you don't have a high body count? But if you're doing the more serious thing,
that would be the way.
Yeah, but if you're doing a more serious game, then it will probably be better. And I'm definitely interested in hearing your thoughts on this. just to have that one character. Because if you're balancing multiple characters, that's going to make it harder to, really get in the mindset of that single character. So maybe a slasher isn't a great genre to use if you're doing this kind of game. Any thoughts on, any thoughts on that as far as picking the genre of horror that you're going to use for these kind of games?
I think it would be harder to run that type of game. I mean, to sort of touch on Anthony's point, and the life that he sort of breathes into his NPCs, that in and of itself is another piece that I think sort of gets turned up to an 11 in a horror game. Not just the people who are potentially antagonists, but then also, voicing or giving life to some of the other characters in reaction to the PCs. Like, you reach into the corpse and the sheriff is over there kind of like, starts puking in the corner, right? Like giving breath and life to those NPCs in that moment, I think is a little bit beyond even the scope of what you might do in a normal game. And then it's just awesome to hear how Anthony, even actually gets up and moves behind people and is animated and agitated at the same time as some of the NPCs. I feel like you can do that in other games, but I think it would be much more pronounced in a horror game, and therefore I think sort of harder to run for that reason.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm in agreement on the slasher thing. That kind of, that's a whole lot of body count and everything else. And I do love a good slasher flick. 80s, we all grew up with them, and they were great. But I think the more specific genre might almost works better. When you start thinking of things like Poltergeist, or more along those lines. Where, and I know I'll let you bring up the Poltergeist method there, Alex. I first heard about that from you, but something more like that, where it's not so much that there's a body count, and sometimes maybe there isn't even a body to begin with, unless you have to take out the ghost or some such, Ghostbusters, that's a little more on the pulpy comedy side, but at its heart, it kind of had that same kind of tonal thing where it's this intangible kind of terror. It's there and everybody knows it's there. And maybe sometimes you catch a glimpse of it, that shadow that moves across. Oh no, it's just a tree. It's fine. Or was it a tree?
Yeah.
Those kind of things where it's there, but it's not there really. I think that kind of genre probably works a little better for that more serious horror style game, I think. And especially with the NPC work. And I'm using that standing behind people, unless they're generally like uncomfortable. But no, that's a good one. That's tasty.
Well, the environment is kind of neat. Like, someone is, like in Call of Cthulhu, someone's starting to lose sanity.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I like to do is, like, after we take a bathroom break or something, their chair has been moved a little bit farther away from other people. And they, there's just that moment. And like, some people will just sit in the chair, and then other people will move it back and say, "No, maybe you could." These are all things that are affecting the player, definitely. But when the lights are low and the candles are flickering, if you're doing all of that, if you're going to that level of performance, it really starts to get into on a subconscious level,
right,
which unfortunately it's a lot harder to do online. But props. I once had a group of adults, fully grown, healthy, fighting men, afraid to open a door because I gave them something on a piece of paper as a comparison. There was an ooze coming out from under the door, and they said, "Well, what does it look like?" And I described the colors: a rich, dark brown, maybe black. In the light, it's hard to tell, because ambiguity is your friend, right? It's hard to tell. Maybe this, maybe that. And they said, "Well, I'm going to touch it. Is it cold?" "Well, it's not exactly cold. It's kind of room temperature." "Oh, and it's sticky." "It's sticky." Well, sticky was kind of the breaking point. And then one guy was like, "Well, what does it smell like?" And I said, "Just a second." And I reached around behind me and I pulled out this piece of paper, which had a dark, oozing, brown, sticky liquid on it. And I said, "It smells exactly like this." And they took it and went, "Oh." Now they were smelling molasses.
but their brains told them.
Right.
So that was interesting. And in the game, there were barrels of molasses behind the door which had been broken, and the molasses had oozed out from under the door. It was realia 100%. It was actually molasses. I was describing molasses. They were smelling molasses. I gave them molasses to touch and smell, and they would not go through the door. And I learned a lot that day about both what to do and what not to do, right? You can absolutely stop play by piling on the junk, but you can also make play really real by talking about the other senses.
Were they actually in a molasses factory in the fiction? Was it actually molasses in the fiction?
Yeah, in the fiction, in the imagined space, it was actually molasses.
Yeah,
Crates of molasses.
Also brilliant.
Also,
That's what I'm saying. Like when I mentioned, like their brains were telling them something else. Like they could have known flat out. Like one of them could have been a cook, going like, "That's molasses." But wait a minute, is it molasses? But like you said, that ambiguity. That's
so when you tell the story, it sounds like a victory for horror, but it's actually an example of going too far.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. That's still. I mean, it's still good though. You know, the lead up, I should say. That's pretty wild. That is awesome.
Yeah. So,
Props can definitely be your friend.
Mhm. Definitely, and you don't necessarily need to go to the lengths of what we did. You know, your Halloween parties where you have a spaghetti and this is his this is what his brains feel like or whatever, right?
Right.
But the props. I mean, that's such the advantage of face-to-face groups, because the online groups you can have, here's the PDF of the half-burned, crumpled up note, but it's just not the same as handing somebody a piece of paper that you've burned the edges of and crumpled or whatever, right? It
Faded ink. There's that tactile, bits.
Yeah. So, do you guys use props in your face-to-face games?
Somewhat. Like it kind of depends. Like the notes and maps, papers like that. Generally, I'll do kind of things like that. If it's like a real serious game and we've been going for a couple sessions, we're more into campaign territory. There's specific elements I might start upping that prop thing. It might be, if I can find something that looks like an actual object or something that they have in the game or that they're going to discover, I'll start bringing more of those elements in. But I wouldn't say I'm generally a prop game master at the table, other than the kind of, I guess, easier ones to do, which are kind of the papers and, torn fragments or a scrap of cloth or something.
If it's mystery, the typical Call of Cthulhu investigation, then I want to have the clues, whatever they are, in the player's hands, the matchbook or the letter or the map or whatever, so that they can do the deduction themselves.
Yeah.
In just horror, like a typical game of vampire, I'm very unlikely to use props and things.
Yeah, I would think, I don't use a lot of props generally. And the fear for me, I mean, I have in the past, but the fear for me is always immersion. So I like to keep immersion hugely high. And I think sometimes you can walk that fine line, right? Is that if people get engrossed in props or what have you at the table, they can lose those pieces of story immersion that are so critical. At least generally, that's sort of my style, is that I would generally prefer to control a lot of these through the story beats and events that are happening, not necessarily through things that I hand out. So that's just my perspective. But I'd be happy, Anthony, to sit in one of your Call of Cthulhu games or one of your mystery games, and because I think that would be a treat, probably.
Right. It's all fear in games until the molasses comes out.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
You're drowning in molasses.
Get back from the bathroom break and my chair's adjusted.
So let me ask this: So Anthony, we're talking about this, and you're a lot of, or you have done a lot of World of Darkness. Can't speak, and Vampire and whatnot. Do you find there's a difference in? Because from my experience, it's to get good horror or that good atmosphere, it's easier. People are just everyday people. And even like when we did Blacklight, so Mark, the guy who wrote ICRPG Blacklight, ran a game of it that Alex and I were in. And it was a great game. And we were agents, so we weren't like average people, right? But we weren't superheroes or supernatural creatures or anything like that. But do you find it's harder to get the results if people are playing vampires or playing higher powered characters?
I did at first, and there was a real enthusiasm for in Werewolf being able to shift to your Krynos form in the supermarket, and all this stuff, or in Mage throwing a lot of paradoxical magic around, or breaking through the shroud and Wraith, and there was a lot of excitement. And so I had to learn as the storyteller to let people enjoy their characters, because horror often has a sense of weakness. You can't do something, or you shouldn't do something, or you'll probably die if you do something. But those games were personal horror, and it was an interesting shift. Like the vampire, I felt a game wasn't going well if the players, at least their character, right, their connection to their character, they realized that they were crossing a line, they were transgressing in some way. So for me, in Vampire, feeding was the game. For the players, the political stuff going on in the background, how they were trying to gain some advantage from an elder, that's what they thought the game was. But for me, the game was, what are you actually going to do in tonight's feeding session? And who is going to be tonight's victim, and how far are you going to go, and how many of the pieces of evidence that you leave behind are you going to cover up? Because eventually, maybe there'll be a police officer, and then what are you going to do about the police officer? And so we were playing on different levels. Shifting to Werewolf, it wasn't really for me about the killing. It was about watching the world die and being incredibly personally, physically powerful, and yet in that context having no power whatsoever. You are fighting the losing battle. How are you going to go out? And Mage likewise. I can bend reality but look at the souls of everyone around me dying. So trying to communicate that with strangers was real work. And then as they became part of the group, it became easier. Like we developed a language, or people began to expect certain things from my game rather than my friend's game. My friend's game is the one where you're throwing fireballs downtown and the technocracy has to come in and clean up. And in my game, well, you run a halfway house for kids from broken homes who can do magic, right? And this world is going to grind them up and spit them out. What are you going to do about it? So
all about the tone.
Well, I will say, guys, we sort of danced around this. We talked about some of the different styles, but I think all of us, in a way, maybe are sort of talking about what I kind of consider maybe the slow burn sort of horror type game.
That's my preferred thing.
Yeah, and whether you're an agent or not, this is sort of how I sort of see it. As human beings, right, we crave really sort of two things in order to have comfort. We crave certainty and we crave control. And to me, horror is at its best when you, as a DM, deprive those two things.
Yes.
So in terms of certainty, I think what we're talking about for me, it's always this growing sense of dread or impending doom. And then the loss of control, this mounting pressure that nothing is going to plan. The equipment breaks, the environment is at odds with us. All of these things keep, no one is coming. The house has locked itself and now we're stuck. Whenever as a DM, you're taking sort of all those little things away and you're making players more desperate, that's when I think horror really sort of shines. And I don't think that sort of template or formula, I don't think it matters if you're an agent fighting creepy little children I don't think it matters if you're, vampires or werewolves and your world is ending and you're losing control and you're losing certainty in terms of the normal realm of your experience. I think if those things are happening at your table, I think potentially you're gonna have a good horror game on your hands. That's just my thought. So
No, I think that's a great point, because that's why I think that's how Delta Green can kind of get misinterpreted sometimes, because people think Delta Green is we're gonna throw grenades at Cthulhu monsters, but played right, that's why Aliens works, right? Or Alien works, because you get overwhelming. That's why the Mechanoids, you guys have all played Palladium. I don't know if any of you played Mechanoids, but the Mechanoids, that's why that works, because you've got laser guns and all this stuff, but it doesn't matter because you're insignificant compared to these horrible cyborg creatures that are out to destroy all humanoids, right? And it's just you're trying to survive as long as you can. And
it really is about survival, especially in those types. Indeed.
Sorry. I was just gonna
not just survival of the characters, but survival of the game. Like, are you doing one shots? Then you can really dial up the horror, the despair, and it's okay for everybody to die at the end, kind of thing. Or are you playing a Call of Cthulhu campaign? Well, how many players are going to want to be desperate, depressed, and feel powerless for the 18 months it takes to play Massive Nyarlathotep or something like that? It's a fine line to walk.
Right, man. Yeah, that's some deep think, and y'all are smarter than I am.
Well, I mean, we were talking a little bit about that before the podcast started. Jason and I were discussing that, but I think, to your point, Anthony, it would be way easier to do all that sense of dread and that loss of control and to really heighten that desperation in a one shot or maybe even a 2-shot or something like that. But if you're talking about trying to keep that over that level of uncertainty and loss of control over an entire campaign, I think that would be just terrible. I think it would be so hard to do that, because I feel like, either players would check out or they just sort of grow numb or accustomed to it eventually. And so if you have any thoughts on that, maybe over the long haul, in terms of your experience, I would be grateful for your advice.
The Alien campaign that we're in has this problem as its central theme, or at least the way people look at Alien. Like, how could you play a campaign game of Alien? Once you've met the alien, then there's no thrill. And recently, Nightfall Games released Terminator, which has the same kind of backlash against it. Like, well, once you meet the Terminator, so what? And I think they are one of the problems, is that we're thinking about being Sarah Connor, who knows nothing and then discovers Terminators are real and then has to survive. Horror.
Yep.
Right. And the challenge I was faced with was everybody in the play group wanted to play Colonial Marines. So highly trained, highly competent, well armed, right? And we've seen in the movies that they can stand up against the xenomorphs physically, given good control of the terrain, good tactics and strategy. So none of the people in the group, well, one of the guys in the group likes horror, the other two prefer action, and they kind of agreed to play Alien as long as we played it for a limited run. So I don't really have an audience that wants a lot of horror. I want kind of military action. So I have to balance out my own drives, kind of minimize my own drives for horror, but still be true to Alien. So it's exactly this situation. How do I keep this going? So I had to remind myself to set up missions where their competence can be assumed, right? Where they can feel like these characters are well trained, are competent, and they can do these things. And then into that, horror comes.
Right.
So
I was just thinking, potentially like you build challenges. So you would build it up, things go out of control, and then they're in the soup, but then maybe they get that sense of relief and then they prevail. But then they move on to the next phase, and then it starts all over again, right? In that universe, is that sort of what you're
Well,
talking about?
in my World of Darkness days, I definitely did it that way because that's how the game was talking to us. Like, you are the storyteller. You've got all these tools. You're manipulating things on a story level, right? And we're going to focus on a slide into darkness. So we're going to manipulate circumstances or situations so that we have that experience. So everything was manipulating the story. Now, what I've gone back to doing is not focusing on story as a product, but as focusing on what's there, what's like the old days with dungeons, right? What's there? What should be there? What can't be there? Why is it there? What is it doing while it's there? And then the player characters are going to go through that area, and everything is going to react, act, or interact as they would. Mm-hmm. So my very competent group of Marines, unfortunately for them, crash landed on LV-426. And they had to survive there for quite a while. So they felt very impressed with themselves for, like a very little water, very little food, right? And they made their way to the crash site. Nobody forced them to go to the crash site. There were reasons why they should go to the crash site. And so as we play through this, they're recognizing we're going to the crash site. And they're all thinking as players, the eggs are there. Their characters know the eggs are there, right? So that everything is matched up. And then they went inside the ship. So inside, I'm like, yay. But at the same time, I'm thinking, okay, well, this is where they come face to face with xenomorphs. But they went in there, locked and loaded. They were ready. They took control of their situation. They did the best that they could. And then horror dropped on them like a hammer. No spoilers. If you want to find out what happened, you can go and see it. It was all recorded live.
Well, you just almost described my whole DM style, which is, the world exists. I drop players loose in it, and off they go, and good luck.
Mm-hmm.
And then the world reacts to the decisions they make.
Yep, that's what I do. It's because trying to plan, it's okay to you figure out the factions, you figure out what's there, and you can give the players an initial push, initial problem, right in the very initial setup. But after that, any plans you have are going to get derailed because the players are going to choose something odd, and you don't want to take away their choice. So it's easier just to know your world and be able to react to what the players are doing while the factions are still doing what they're going to do. And if the players interact with them, great, they might change what they do. If not, then those plans will go forward, right? But
for all those same reasons you guys talked about, because no plan survives interaction with players. I keep all of my notes so brief. I'll have this is my whole truth, and it's usually just a couple sentences of this is what is happening, and then there's just a couple bullet points of these are the things that are going to happen when they go to these spaces, and it's more reaction to those choices of the players than anything else.
True.
That's a definite truth.
Yeah. Now one shots go ahead. Sorry, I apologize.
Sorry. I think games that focus more on dealing with the story involve more negotiation somehow, like spending currency or you're rolling to see who gets to narrate or describe or whatever. So, but I find that also affects the ability to have that in-character experience. Mm-hmm. So I'm trading my appreciation for a horror story that's going to be magnified for my ability to immerse in the perspective of the character. So it's not worse, it's just different. And if I really like horror stories, then I'm going to enjoy being a part of making one. And if I enjoy experiencing a character who can maybe overcome this horrible situation if the dice let me, then I'm going to prefer some other kind of game.
I think that maybe gives us a good segue here to, I was just going to mention, I guess in one shots, you're more linear kind of entry, is a little more acceptable than a campaign, obviously. But I guess that brings us to the question. It's a good segue, the idea of systems, and we don't have to, and I think you could probably do horror with just about any game system, rule system, but some are definitely more some systems help you more than others, right? And I'm curious on your ideas on, is meta currency, I guess depends what you want to do with it. Because some of these games are built for horror, right? Like Dead of Night. And some of these games are built with the idea where the meta currency help, when they do things to help, like with the genre expectations is when they get like meta currency and things, so, but it's not, to help the story. And I apologize for wittering here, but some games, but does meta currency in general, is that a negative in these kind of things? I guess, are there better game systems to run than others? And has Call of Cthulhu 7th edition made that more difficult than previous editions of Call of Cthulhu? Not to pick on Chaosium, but since that's the big boy in the room, right?
Right. Well, I mean, I think meta currencies, like, I mean, I don't have a problem with them. Like, if they are part of a system, if they're a built-in part of the system, like I'm all for using them, because, just knowing that element, or that tone you're setting in going into a horror game, letting the players have something that can maybe buy their way out of a situation, in that whole like metagaming bit, like I'm all for it. Let them have it, because I mean, it's kind of a trade-off, right? I mean, they've got like this ability, whatever this meta currency happens to be in a given system, they have this ability to lighten things up for them. That works great in that scene, and that's something that you as a GM can actually utilize, knowing that they have that. You can come in with like that heavy sweeping, darkness, or not pushing boundaries or anything, but you can come in with like maybe a heavier hand on like that reveal, or that mounting terror that something is generally wrong. You can kind of like dial that up a little bit, because the players have this ability to say like, whoa, okay, well, let's turn on some of these lights here. I'm going to do such and such, and whoop, and shed some light into this. And that kind of gives them, I guess, almost like a release, like they have control of the pressure valve. So like, the steam doesn't build and build and build and blow that boiler tank. Like they can let some of that bleed out, and then it builds again. It kind of, and I'm sure that's something like all of us have done in games. It's that there's that kind of roller coaster, those peaks and valleys throughout the game. But I'm all for a meta currency, because that's just another tool that can kind of help with the player immersion. It lets them have that creative freedom of how they're going to implement being able to use this currency. How am I going to spend it this time? What things do I have that are going to let me dial this thing down? So, I mean, I think it's great, and there are quite a few games that have those elements built in, which I'm all for them, especially as a player and as a GM. Like, I love them as a player, and I love players having them as a GM, because that just means I think that's quack more.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I like them as a game master, and I don't like them as a player. The way that I prefer to play is very in character. So I don't really want to talk about the system if I don't have to, right? So I like to play a game for a long time, so that we have non-verbal signals about things. And so if I've got, like in a 2D20 game, if I have momentum and the game master has threat, I want to use physical chips for this, so that I can slide a point of momentum across the table and not say, I'm going to spend a point of momentum to gain an extra point of damage. And everyone goes, oh, good idea. Good.
Yeah, exactly.
That's totally fun in Star Trek. Like we're playing on a different plane in Star Trek. We're going for different play goals in Star Trek. And I enjoy that part of it. But in a horror game, I don't want that conversation about the use of the system. I want the system to be known and familiar, but not, but as the game master, I never get to reach that level. I don't have anything to immerse in as a character. Right. So it doesn't bother me at all. And I really like the players to have those tools. So it's a little disconnection going on for me there.
Well, I think that's the thing, though, is like as a player, liking to have those things. Like you had mentioned, having that physical thing that you can just slide over, instead of having to, I'm spending this to do this thing. It's that ability to slide something over or let it be known in some other fashion without saying I'm spending a penny or whatever, some such. Being able to do it in character with something that's, helping your character goals, like literally it could be turning on the light or cash this thing in or whatever. Like, holy crap, I have a book of matches, cashed it in and like, things like that. Like when you can spend it to in a character moment, like that's where I enjoy having them. And I will burn through those in the first encounter. I'll use them all.
And that's good play.
Joe is a bit notorious at our table in that respect. They don't survive like the first 5 minutes typically.
That's funny. Anthony's done you did it on your podcast. I don't know if you did a YouTube channel. I think it was on your blog too, but were specifically for Alien, how the verbiage of the game helps you stay in that immersion, right?
Yeah. The terms they use in the Year Zero engine and that were colored for Alien are very natural. Stress, for example. And so, rather than please take 1 point of esoteric dread. Okay, it's just like you're starting to feel a little bit more stress. And and you can just gesture, like how much stress can be added. And you're still communicating. You're still communicating on the player level, but you're not engaging that human interaction part, the verbal interaction part with the game mechanics. And so shoot, aim, and so rather than I use my firearm skill and I apply the aim bonus, right? I'm going to shoot him, and I'm going to take my time. I'm going to aim. It's a completely different experience.
Yeah, that's one of the things. The way the system is written. One of the reasons I love ICRPG, because the language for the mechanics is that same way. It's very conversational, whether a task is easy or a task is hard. Is this what you're going to attempt to do? Like, well, how much effort do you put into it? They're all like terms that are very specific and very conversational, so that it doesn't feel like you're, jumping into like you said, +2 to this. I am attacking for blah blah. It's a lot more. It's a lot more natural, and that definitely is a thing that helps. With a system, especially if you're going into horror, because nothing breaks immersion like oh, hold on, it's tactical advantage 2.
Right.
So that's going to give me an extra D6 to, like boom, all of a sudden nothing is scary anymore. And you have to start all over.
Right. So if you don't play in a game where atmosphere is the goal, then all of that stuff, searching the character sheet, finding the perfect solution, having the perfect feat, that can be really exciting and really fun. I feel like my tone is going to make it sound like I hate that kind of play, but I don't. A lot of my friends really make it fun. But if we're going for horror, if it's going to be this slow burn, very fragile mood or tone, then we have to recognize it can be broken, and so what can we do to mitigate it, or what can we ramp up to kind of balance it out?
Indeed.
So what haven't we asked that you're curious about, Alex? We'll put you in the listener's chair here again.
I would just add to that last piece. I want a system that's going to get out of the way. And I don't think it really matters what that system is. But to Anthony's point, to me, immersion is the key. I have not played Dread before. I'm going to play it here in a few weeks at a convention. Cool. I signed up to play. We're all survivors in a Survivor show, like literally like Survivor on an island, but apparently there's something else on the island. So I'll be curious to see how that goes with a Jenga tower and whether or not the immersion stays high at the table with that physical stress involved that we talked about. I just tied that in a bow. But
it's going to be fun regardless.
Yeah, it's going to be a blast. It's going to be a hoot. But to me, whatever that system is, I really would prefer something that just gets out of the way so that immersion level can stay high. To me, that is my polar star. That is the goal. That is my vision, my mission statement. Like whatever your key is, that's key for me. In terms of what I would ask, I don't know. I would just kind of throw this out there, and this is something that I thought about, and I would be curious for your all's reaction. One of the ways that I might manage this, maybe for a one shot, or manage horror in a one shot, or even as a new DM, is I would try to look at certain story beats and try to have certain story beats that happen, not in the sense of necessarily scheduled events, but in terms of envisioning the world. I would envision certain things. And to me, a good template felt like the movie Predator, the original one with Arnold Schwarzenegger. Now you're gonna laugh at me for a minute by saying that, but because Predator is not, I wouldn't say a horror movie per se, but I think it gets right a lot of things in terms of the story elements. So in terms of that impending sense of dread and uncertainty, first of all, you find out that the first team that went in, really skilled guys, okay, they're like now hanging 40 feet up, skinned alive. And you got somebody, an NPC, who openly says, oh, it was probably insurgents. And meanwhile, everybody's going, that wasn't insurgents. Right. And then you've got the guy who, by the way, may not necessarily be on your side. And oh, by the way, he keeps giving away your position in the bush every 5 minutes. So that sucks. And then it all leads up to you hit the wrong depot. Well, there's something out of your control. Now you're cut off. Now you have to hike. It's the worst possible terrain ever. And oh, by the way, the jungle just came alive. Guess what? They don't do that. Some lady is screaming about it. Also, 2 minutes later, a 10 centimeter or 10-inch diameter hole appears in some guy's chest, fully cauterized. The toughest guy on your team, by the way, with the huge gun, he's done. And slowly they're all picking it off. And then the best guy you got on the team, like your tracker, your experienced guy, he turns around and says, nobody's making it out of here. To me, when you have all those sort of story kind of beats that happen, just like in the movie Predator, that feels like, maybe as an inexperienced horror DM, a good template potentially to try to emulate. Like if I were to sit down, like I'm going to do a one shot, I want to really ramp this up in terms of loss of control, in terms of loss of uncertainty and things beyond normal human events. Like, the air just doesn't shimmer like that, right? Like that sort of stuff, I might try to hype those sort of things up to maybe sort of get my players to that desperate breaking point where ultimately maybe they can potentially survive and feel that relief, or maybe they get wiped out at the end. Right. And I'd be curious in terms of that line of thinking, what your all's reactions are.
Well, that's straight up pacing and tone. And there's a lot of the guys keep dropping, so that's a little bit on the slasher side, but that pacing is exact. And again, I have to cite back, like I'm gonna have to have you break the poltergeist method down, which I coined by a buddy of ours, Xander, and it very much is about the Poltergeist movie. But I think if I can have you just do a quick rundown on the poltergeist method, Alex, and then as you say it, think about Predator, because I think you'll see that it's that pacing, that tonal shift is kind of the same beats.
Sure. So in terms of planning almost any sort of campaign,
Put you on the spot.
In terms of drama and story, in terms of a master plot, I typically run amusement park method, by the way, where people can go anywhere in the park. So they have these nodes and they have all these choices, but then once they kind of get on a ride, they're on rails for a little while. They experience that part of the world for a little while, and then maybe they can go somewhere else. So that's usually my typical MO. And generally in terms of story beats, I think about, okay, what does the big bad look like? What does the evil in the basement look like? Ultimately, the heroes will have to go down and confront this evil in the basement. And then I reverse engineer and work backwards to that moment. And so characters aren't going to immediately, because evil doesn't work this way, have the poltergeist spring out in scene one. They're not even going to know it's poltergeist. They're not even going to know anything's wrong with the world. They're just going to be going about their day. Then they might hear some chains rattle, or they might hear a rumor that something is wrong. And then they're going to get embroiled in some events that gradually lead and build towards, oh, there are books being stacked, in terms of story beats. Oh, something else is wrong over here. Like people saw some apparition. Oh, that's not good. Maybe they encounter the big bad somewhere along the way, but it gets away, or they get crushed and have to regroup. And then ultimately it all builds till they're down in the basement trying to do an exorcism metaphorically in terms of the story. Like they have to go where evil exists and sort of quash it. And that's sort of a formula or technique that I use because I find that a lot of people don't understand story. Like, how do I do a good, like I'm a new DM. How do I do a great story, right? Here are the beats and here's a formula that you can replicate, kind of back end your way into some good DMing almost, in order to tell a good story at your table. So that's the poltergeist method and sort of how I kind of approach it. I think where I say the movie Predator differs is in terms of that pacing and tone, the things that are happening that are constantly outside of these characters' control, and that intense growing sense of dread. These guys got crushed. All these NPCs keep getting picked off. I think you take that formula and maybe ratchet it up to an 11. But again, I would be curious maybe to hear Anthony's thoughts, somebody a bit more experienced than I am in terms of what you think about all that that I just dumped on you. Sorry. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk.
It's an Alex talk.
I think, when someone buys a horror game, they think I'm going to use this horror game and I'm going to scare my players. And as we talked about at the beginning, that's not going to happen. Like you could startle your players by creating that sense of fear. The player wants the character to act afraid because it's scary, and will modify their behavior because of the fearfulness of the situation. That's not going to happen just because of you. They have to buy in, like we said. They have to be willing to bring it forward. They have to even understand what the genre is, which is why we talked about the session 0 part. What kind of horror are we in? Is it a slasher type thing where I should expect my character to die, so I should not be upset? I should enjoy that part. Or am I actually trying to survive? All this stuff. So if we were going to do Predator, like how are we going to do Predator? So we, from the point of view of not looking at beats or dropping in beats, but getting that collaboration going, that buy-in going, there's some reason for a team of military specialists to go into the jungle. So Predator, the movie, gives us the example. There's an extraction that they're specifically trained for. The deal is sweetened until they agree to do it. Fair enough. If, for example, they chose not to do it, well, then the second best team, who are also going to be their friends, are going to go in and they're going to be wiped out. So now we've got guilt on top of everything else. So eventually, probably, they're going to go. If they don't want to go that second time, they don't want to be playing this game. So that's your signal.
Right.
Yeah.
So they go. They get there. They've got bad intelligence. But some of the things that the movie can do that it's hard to do at the table is the interpersonal, getting a English setter tail in the face, which you can't see, but the other guys are enjoying.
Right.
What the movie can do that it's difficult to do at the table is have the interactions between very fearful people who know something you don't know.
Yes.
And your competent player characters.
Yeah.
And so having a larger cast, for example, having a mix of player and non-player characters becomes essential.
You would have to. Yeah.
Yeah. And portraying them believably has to become essential. We have to learn to trust the girl they find in the jungle. We have to learn to distrust their old buddy.
Mm-hmm.
Right. These things need to happen so this is the story beat stuff. This is the agenda. This is, who is this character? So I like to do that by just understanding who the character is. I make the character and I put them in the situation. But a lot of people will do it like at this point, like in session 2, I'm going to make them suspicious of this character, or I'm going to make them trust this character. It may sound the same, it may look the same, but it really isn't the same, right? You're operating on a different level, and in the player level way, the in character level way, the pacing is being determined by the play experience. They will trust that character when they trust that character, and they will distrust the character when they distrust it. And it doesn't matter. And I don't care when that happens. I don't care really if that happens. It's just an element that I have contributed to the situation. Whereas if I put it down in my notes in session 2, the distrust is now a thing, and I have to make them distrust the character. So now I'm not focusing on atmosphere. Now I'm not focusing on tone. I'm focusing on portraying this NPC a particular way to get a particular response.
Right.
And it has an effect. So then we have not only the 10-inch hole, right? Maybe that's an NPC that gets blown away.
Well, I think you would have to do that. You'd have to have, if you were to run that as a one shot or even reskin it in a different type of game, which I think you could, you would need a supporting cast of NPCs, just like you're talking about. People that you trust, people that you don't trust, people who are wigging out, people who are giving away your position, people who are helpfully saying it's just insurgents, and everybody knows it's not insurgents. Right. And then slowly all those idiots just start getting picked off, which further heightens, I think, the four people who are part of the players or whatever.
Sure. Yeah. So we have a player character who's the best friend of an NPC character. The NPC character dies horribly. If we're playing Call of Cthulhu or Delta Green or something like that, this is a huge sanity hit, right?
Yes.
And that guy begins to unravel. He's like dry shaven in the
Exactly.
in the jungle, thinking deep thoughts, and that in an Alien, that high level of stress and agitation, that begins to spread to other characters.
Yeah.
And this could be handled purely through the points, right? Well, your buddy's upset, so please take another stress. Or it can be handled by the game master being the voice of your inner thoughts, your inner doubts, inner worries. It's like, Billy, he's looking a little agitated, and why does he keep rubbing his knife on his chest, or
right. Why does he keep staring off into the jungle for minutes?
Right.
Yeah.
Just asking questions.
So this kind of ties back to what we were talking about earlier, right? About breathing life into these NPCs, Anthony, that you talked about so well, and actually demonstrating that agitation. I think those behavior would be so critical in terms of potentially bringing us to life.
Right.
This is also where, and you guys may do this automatically, but for these kind of games, especially if you're doing more, even for a one shot, even more than especially for longer games, you want is the GM to have some kind of relationship map. You want to make a basic relationship map where you've got the names and the lines going, what their connections are, because that way you can pull on those connections, especially because if you have good players that are trying to inhabit those characters, then pulling on those relationship maps. And one thing like Dead of Night talks about, the one guy that gives advice in there are a couple different authors that give advice in there, but one of them talks about they always use have romantic relationships in their game, and they often put they want to have mistrust built in initially, so they'll have love triangles built in the game and things like that. Now that wouldn't, obviously in your Predator scenario, you're not going to do that, but having that relationship map, or you could do that Predator. Actually. Yeah, I mean you could do that, but having that relationship map is going to make it easier on you as the GM to track this stuff and to give those prompts. So that might be something.
Because you got a lot of stuff on your mind.
Yeah.
So if you have that easy visual cue of how people are connected, and that you can just make tick marks on,
right?
Like a red mark is a stressful interaction, and a blue mark is a positive interaction. Just keep an eye on things. Just stuff to make it easy.
Well, I think in terms of my takeaways, you guys have hit three really good ones, and that is, one, this focus on relationships and the intense focus on the NPCs. I think that's huge. I think also, you were talking about Anthony, like maybe telling the characters how they're feeling a little bit, and not
them. Right. Asking them how they're feeling.
I mean, well, but not necessarily, I don't think in terms of emotions, right? I think they have to generate those. But in terms of like, hey, like you're wondering about this guy, or maybe this is making you a little bit nervous, or you feel the sweat trickle. Maybe, I mean, maybe I'm off on that, but I feel like there's a piece there, perhaps. Even.
Yeah, I mean, like you're going to tell someone how wide a door is. Just a second, everybody's caution.
All the puppies.
Okay.
Yeah. And my third one was atmosphere, by the way. That was my third takeaway. But yeah.
You're gonna describe the physical location. You're gonna describe the jungle or the creepy house or whatever. But one thing that often gets missed I mean, we talk about the five senses, you know, the smell or the temperature or the dampness, humidity, whatever of a place. Sometimes it's difficult to remember to include those, but it's also difficult to expect a player to interpret your description of body language or an expression properly. So, you know, he's frowning. We're going to usually link that to anger, but it could be concentration, it could be confusion, there's a whole bunch of stuff it could be. So by asking questions, or rather than saying he looks confused, and you could if you have a character who should just be able to recognize that very social character, right? You know, he's confused, but we can rely on our ambiguity again to talk about, well, you know, is he thinking about something?
Yeah, that's brilliant.
Right. It's as much what you say as what you don't say. Which,
Yeah, that's great.
Was that a shadow, or was it the shadow of a tree outside, or did something just move across the room? You're not sure. I also think a fun one, just for a brief interjection, is and it's like probably one of the cheesiest tricks you could use, or maybe not tricks, but it's probably it's like that cheap tool you buy on the way out. It's on the rack next to the gum. It's that little flashlight, kind of a GM tool. The simple question, are you sure? That one will send them nuts. And it's like the simplest, easiest thing. Oh, I'm going to open the door. Are you sure? How do you open the door? The little, are you sure you want to do that? Like that'll, it's more gimmicky. But but
it has the same effect as reaching out for the Jenga piece, right? You're smashing the player in the feels there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I need you to tell me exactly how you open the door.
Yeah, it makes them second guess and start doubting themselves. And I guess that flows right into that same tone, that same kind of horror element, that ambiguity, or the ambiguity that you were talking about, is if they're doubting their own mind, you're probably going to have a successful horror game. But again, with the buy-in, player buy-in.
Yeah, the other thing, of course, in this, no matter what genre you're playing, immerse yourself outside the game, you the GM, in reading, that genre, or absorbing that genre on your off time. Listen to audiobooks, do it, because we had a panel member that couldn't make it, but he does such a great job in his games because he's immersed in, not only the old pulps, but the, newer sword and sorcery stories and all this kind of stuff. And so when he's doing descriptions, in the games that I'm in with him, the descriptions are just so spot on and so evocative. It sounds like, Howard's, doing it, right? Or whoever, pick your favorite pulp or sword and sorcery author. And so it, obviously you don't want to just sound like a book, but the more you are immersed in the genre, whatever the genre is, the more those words are going to come freely, and the descriptions are going to be there at the tip of your tongue to, so it sounds right, if that makes sense.
And that's a two-way street, right? Like if you didn't know that he sounded like Howard, you're thinking, well, this guy's he's really good at describing things, and then that's the end of it. But if you recognize that this is like a hook for immersion, right? You can actually feel yourself sinking down into the book, and you can respond appropriately. And I think there's a reason why Lovecraft stories are in the Call of Cthulhu rule book. Whether that's the Call of Cthulhu or the Dunwich Horror or both, that's pretty helpful.
Very good.
Yeah, there's a huge difference between having that word of Lovecraftian terms or eldritch terms, right, and actually being immersed in literature. So, it's one thing to throw undulating into your sentence. It's another thing to, use it correctly, right? So,
right.
But
the big one during the World of Darkness days was tenebrous.
Yeah, man, that and Maw was everywhere.
Yeah.
Great. Well, so is there anything, as we come to the end of our time together, is there anything that we haven't said that people would like to say? Is there anything, topic that you guys think we need to cover, or we should
Man, I guess like one quick note is, look for the type of game that you want to play or run. And then I guarantee you there is a game system out there that was kind of specifically built and tailored for that specific type that you're looking for. So like, just pull out that Google real quick and just do a quick search, but truly know like what it is you're looking for. And there is a game for that. There is one purpose built to help support that kind of thing. But you can kind of play any game and make it fit. But there are games out with specific tools that I think could help some folks out.
Yeah, and
it's all like
light or heavy doesn't matter so much.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
To Alex's point about the system getting out of the way, that feeling of the system not being in the way is tied more to your familiarity with it than to any particular property of its own. Like the lightest game that you don't know, you're still thinking about how do I do this?
Right.
Yeah.
So it just is. So if we want to do GURPS horror, or we want to do Call of Cthulhu horror, or if we want to do horror in Mithras, a full-blown, full-featured D100, or if we want to do horror in Savage Worlds or in Ubiquity, there's stuff to learn at the beginning, and then you learn it.
Yeah.
And then you start to really play. So expect a period of less than satisfactory results maybe at the beginning. And
sure.
Yeah, that's true in all things.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to be good when you start.
Yeah, I ran a Aces and Eights game last night, and we used the online VTG tools and all, and it went pretty well. But because it's the first time that group had played, when you're doing the count, Ace and Eights acts on a count. Who's acting on four? Who's because each count is a tenth of a second, and so it was a little bit clunky. Now, 2 or 3 games in, it'll be a lot smoother. But that initial session, just because we're all, everybody's learning the rules and all, it's going to be a little bit clunky. But and any final thoughts there, Alex?
No, I was just musing about how, everybody has to learn how to drive a car, right? Well, I mean, not everybody, but generally your experience is if you learn to drive a car, right, your first time, it's not so hot. But then eventually you get to the point where you just wake up at your destination and go, how did I get here today? I'm not sure. Not sure how that happened. I think the same would be true for game systems. If you run them enough, it does get to the point where, it's just on autopilot. So for the most part, now there are some, if you're constantly looking up charts, maybe that's not quite the case, but.
Right.
Yeah. I think my final thought would be go back to the very beginning, what Joe said in the very beginning. You have to know your players. And you have to accept, as much as you want to run a certain game, if your players aren't into it, just accept that group is not going to play hard.
That's
and don't try to force it. Just accept it. Maybe you'll find another group at another point or whatever. Not saying leave that group, but just accept that game style is not going to work with those players, and just play what will work with them. But don't, especially what we're talking about, trying to do an atmospheric horror game is not something that could be forced. And it's just one of those things you just have to, if you don't have the buy-in, you just decide what game you guys can play together and have fun playing that game together.
All right. The hobby is 90% communication. So talk to your players.
Well, Jason, thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. I'm glad to hear that my Predator idea as a template maybe has some legs. Anthony's giving me the thumbs up, so take that as a really good sign. And Anthony, it was really great meeting you. And
you too.
I understand you're kind of far away, but man, I'd love to get in the game with you sometime. So that would be great to link up with you at some point. But really a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for all your advice and insight. And Joe, I know you, dude.
I'm sorry, man.
No.
But we have just proven that the 4 of us can sync up a schedule.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
True. Well, and for the folks who are listening too, there was a lot of head nodding going on. So, for all these folks, who were talking about stuff, like we were all sort of nodding along. Like I think in general, a lot of us, are really on similar wavelengths. I think there's a few differences, but there's a lot that we're agreeing on in terms of this horror talk. So that was really cool to see us come together. So thanks again, Jason.
Yeah, no, thank you guys for coming on. I really appreciate your coming. I guess the last thing we'll do here before we sign off is if you want to plug anything, and we'll go around. Anthony, anything to plug?
I'm currently writing something I can't talk about, and I'm editing something I can't talk about. So I can't talk about that. A lot of, I guess there's a really old but beloved blog post on my blog at castingshadowsblog.com called "On Fear, Horror, Terror, and Cosmic Horror on a Dime a Day." And so I think if you type Runeslinger on a dime a day or something, it'll just pop up. And that has my thoughts on using the environment in horror and that kind of thing. But no, I just really enjoyed being here. It was fun. Thanks for asking.
Excellent. There'll be a link to that in the show notes, folks. Alex, anything to plug?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say Joe and I are very active over in the Runehammer community. That's no secret. You can either find us there on Facebook or on the Runehammer Discord or on the Runehammer forums. So there is a dedicated forum online. And then, of course, we've just launched our own channel, Ultimate Effort, the Ultimate Effort Show with Alex and Joe, where we're trying to showcase a lot of the cool members of our community. We have a ton of people who don't just play ICRPG; they're playing all kinds of games. We want to showcase those people, kind of like Anthony, and you, Jason, like really good folks who are in the hobby, and we don't all do things the same way, but it's awesome to talk to those folks and hear about their experiences and what they're doing, and so that's great. And then I think, Joe, we're trying to dole out some DM advice here and there, so come check us out, Ultimate Effort Show.
Cool.
Joe, anything to plug?
Yeah, and I'll give a shout out to Never Sleep Again. Could be a fun horror one shot. I know you had oh my gosh, how did I just space on
Daniel Norton of Bandits
yeah,
Keep?
Daniel Norton, Bandits Keep. I can't believe I just I'm sorry, Dan. You just had him talk about it. I would recommend using, if you go to look at that on drive through, watch that or listen to that podcast, that interview with Daniel there, that when they did a review of Never Sleep Again, and run it the way he talks about, because that was brilliant. It was way better than what I had. That's all I got.
Okay, I will put a link to that in the show notes as well.
And like Alex said, Ultimate Effort Show. Thanks.
Excellent. So thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it. Hopefully we can get you all on again sometime for a different topic. I really enjoyed having you guys guests on Story before. So okay.
Thank you.
Take care, folks. We'll talk to you next week.
Bye.
A Nerds and Co broadcast, Cerebral podcast. Let's savor all the flavors from the spine of Capstrong. The all stars and pods past, Cerebral podcast. You're counting down your last as you admire them all. The sun is blinding teeth, or soon escaping your brain. What I mean is this exchange of rich and from what I understand. Don't look now, this people is coming, and all that's left is the crying and the running. You can bring it, you can hide, I'll think about in any order. Just another brain of people toss us running for the border. Just a snack like a one, did I stutter? We are MP, it's no respected buzz. You can eat on a bacon, and it's just as never say it. It's savoring the flavor of the memories it created.